So to close out the year, I'm very excited to introduce Sara Grossman. Professor Grossman is currently our Barron visiting professor in environmental humanities, but also is at Bryn Mawr as associate professor of environmental studies. Professor Grossman, Sara, has a number of different areas of expertise, and actually in today's discussion, a few of them are going to be bridged together. Environmental humanities, disability studies, American studies. I have a crib because many of these things are the history of science, a number of different topics, and I think they will be woven together in today's lecture. And so without further ado, Sara, take it up.
First of all, thank you all for being here on an 80-degree sunny day after one of the most challenging winters I think we have had in this region, just in terms of the cold. I am excited to talk today, and I just wanted to begin by thanking Gabe and Kathy and other folks with HMEI, Hans, Amber, Megan, Gabriel, and Allison for welcoming me this year. I'm reaching the end of my year at HMEI now, and excited to give this talk in this moment because I've had a chance to work on some of this research this year, so looking forward to sharing it with you all. I am an environmental humanities scholar, and I work in the areas of creative arts and cultural history. And before I jump into everything, I wanted to let you know that I have slides available on my website. You can just go to this address. I'll be moving through things kind of quickly, and so if you want to linger to look at some of the images a little bit longer, you can access this version. It's not for circulation or publication, just for this setting today. But as I was saying, I'm an environmental humanities scholar. I work in the creative arts and cultural history. To date, my work has focused on how we make sense of unruly things, from disabled bodies and disability more generally to meteorological phenomena. This is my first academic monograph on the left here, and a poetry book on the right, and in the middle just an essay about disabilities there. At Princeton this year, I've developed courses on environmental mending, asking, can we mend our way to more sustainable life on Earth? And I've also developed courses around environmental waste and the process of repair as an intervention into waste culture. In coordination with environmental studies students here this year, I also undertook a 2-semester project on weather printing, where we use cyanotype and ice to create non-numerical records of the weather, which we eventually formed into a weather quilt at the end of this term. From weather printing to studies of waste, both my teaching and my research has been rooted in environmental humanities practices. The environmental humanities is an interdisciplinary field that recognizes the necessity of pluralistic knowledge for addressing the crises of our time. Forms of creativity drive the field, often in combinatory fashion, from creative writing practices to community organizing, from attunement to climate anxiety to DIY ways to address the collective continuance of life on Earth. These modes are leveraged to arrive at critical insights and new ways of operating. We're trying to learn how to equip ourselves with tools to change the world, while also learning, quite simply, how to live on a damaged one. Through diverse methods gathered from across disciplines and through partnerships that exceed the bounds of the university, environmental humanists attend to the ravages of the past to propose different ways to inhabit a shared future. More recently, environmental humanities scholars have engaged disability studies as an overlapping knowledge domain. Disability studies takes the contingency between environments and bodies as its starting point, and much like the environmental humanities, challenges dominant perceptions of the body as separate from the context in which they live, work, and play. And that's drawn from Ray and Sara's introduction to their book. Both environmental humanities and disability studies begin from the proposition that bodies are intimately tied to the biospheric context they inhabit. In investigating how to live on our damaged world, the environmental humanities often asks what life might look like at the brink of damage, death, upheaval, and loss. as well as how to intervene and change course. As Joni Adamson, professor at Arizona State University, asks, must we continue on this path? Or, as Robin Wall-Kimmerer puts it, what does it take to abandon what does not work and take the risks of uncertainty? Disability studies has long been interested in these same questions, inquiring into new modes of life, examining the edges of living from the perspective of the damaged, the near death, the upheaved, and the lost. Though disability studies contains multiple streams, from social, cultural, and political analyses of contemporary disabled life to unpacking disability in the creative arts and mapping disability, medical, and social history across time, the field has recently turned its attention to the overlaps between disabled bodies and lands, as well as the critical knowledges that are part of disabled survival on a daily basis. More than sickness or unlucky fate, disability studies is a field that inquires into disability as a state of vitality, where critical knowledge unfolds and paves future paths. So both of these fields, environmental humanities and disability studies, are poised toward living under loss and finding a record of whatever life there is to have there. Recuperation and joy as a world dims, creative approaches to sinking, or new tools for living on a planet that requires we all swim. Yet the move to integrate disability studies into the environmental humanities and environmental studies more broadly has been slow and at times very sticky. Disability has tended to function as a nightmare scenario in environmental circles, where it is the result of a biosphere gone wrong, an injunction against a bodily dystopia best avoided. Putting aside the problem of solving the environmental injustices of chemical exposure as they manifest in disabled life, disabled people do still live. And their lives, whether marked by such injustices or not, are still worth living. Most apocalyptic fiction tends to write disabled people out of the future. Disabled people rarely survive the apocalypse. Emily St. John Mandel's 2014 novel, Station 11, which was also turned into a miniseries, kills off its only disabled character early on in the novel and the miniseries. You can, it's actually a wonderful novel and a wonderful miniseries with respect to this and outside of this, so I'd highly recommend. But in fact, disabled communities have survived their own apocalypses time and time again, from imprisonment to forced sterilization. As the age of disability dawns, to borrow from Sonora Taylor, what can fields interested in living on a damaged planet amid and with damaged life make of this? The kind of pluralistic knowledge you need depends on the humanistic questions you are asking about environments or the crises you are aimed to address. The research I'm here to talk about today, which I've been able to undertake in this year at Princeton, is part of a larger book on the kinds of habitable futures disabled communities have fought for across the 20th century. It brings together histories of disabled survival with present-day calls for more diverse and experimental techniques for living in and amid environmental change. What do we learn when we look toward disability history with an attention to not only what has been lost, but also the varied ways that disabled people have learned to survive in a world that has been openly hostile to them? Today I will tell two stories, so sit back and relax, about disabled youth who, in the early 20th century, who were held in compliance and alliance with nature spaces. A note on terminology. Early 20th century language about disabled people utilizes categorical terms that we now understand to be ableist and offensive. I do reproduce this language in my slides when the language is connected to primary source material, and I do reproduce this language in speech when I'm citing from primary source material, but I'll use contemporary language such as disabled kids or children or disability communities as a replacement for period-specific language other times. I also reference particular pediatric patients throughout the work, and unless they were co-creators of the material that I'm sharing, I usually blur their faces and only use their first names. On December 20th, 1932, Dr. John Royal Moore completed 11 orthopedic surgeries. It was Wednesday, an unusually long day. Surgeries had been on pause the previous week, so there was a backlog at the Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That day, the patients ranged from 12 months to 12 years old, though the hospital saw patients ranging from birth to 14. For 12-and-a-half-year-old Henrietta, this was her second spinal surgery within 2 weeks' time. The same was true for 7-year-old Billy. Both Henrietta and Billy were given gas and ether by nurse Lillian Macrail. They ended surgery and were deposited in the hospital's recovery room. Upon waking, they would return to their wards for the process of recovery, which might last weeks or months. Anna was 11 years old when she was admitted to the hospital on June 7, 1933. Her first surgery was on December 15th, her second on December 29th, her third on January 12th of 1934, her fourth on March 2nd. She was released after her fourth surgery, spending 9 months at the hospital. She was being treated for what is now medically termed hip dysplasia, but which at the time was called a congenital dislocation of the hips. Anna entered the hospital around the same time as Otis, and they often went into and out of surgery within days of one another. Otis began his surgeries on January 19, 1933, at 3.5 years old. His second surgery was on January 26, 1934. On that day, Dr. Moore lengthened his Achilles and his right foot tendon. Otis had another surgery on February 6th, where Dr. Moore worked with his heel cord, and he was released following his third surgery, spending a little over 6 months at the hospital for a congenital difference of the foot, or what medical professionals termed at that time clubfoot. Otis and Anna probably knew Alma, who at 11 years old spent over 1.5 years at the hospital, having 8 surgeries to address physical changes to her body after the onset of TB. Henrietta and Billy, Anna, Otis, and Alma lived at the hospital full-time during their surgical stays. Alma celebrated her 12th birthday there. Shriners Hospital began as an inpatient and long-term stay orthopedic hospital that treated physically disabled children. The hospital did not admit, quote, feeble-minded, end quote, children, so was entirely focused on the treatment of physically disabled children who they deemed, quote, mentally fit. It was a hospital where no patient would pay, so entirely supported by charity, and it was open to all children with respect to race, though at least at their first hospital in Louisiana, they kept segregated wards. Importantly, Shriners was a social club that was founded in the 1870s, and like many other 19th century fraternal organizations, adopted Arabic iconography in its clothing and logos. As part of their charitable work, they formed nonprofit children's hospitals free to patients that specialized in orthopedic conditions. Shriners described itself as attending to, quote, the surgical care of crippled children, end quote. By 1933, Shriners operated 11 hospitals across North America, many of which had on-site schools. Children as young as 9 months remained in the hospital setting with their parents until, quote, everything that was going to be done was done. Dr. Andrew Newman from the Philadelphia unit remarked, quote, pediatric orthopedic patients were totally isolated, totally secluded, and totally at the mercy of the operating surgeons. No informed consent, no second opinions. Parents played no role whatsoever. Patients remained in the hospital for months, sometimes years at a time, undergoing as many surgeries as needed to, quote, straighten the twisted little spirits which are found in so many of the misshapen bodies, end quote. As Leslie Reagan explores in Monstrous Births, the early 20th century medical pathologizing of visually anomalous bodies led to the normalization of institutionalizing children. Moving away from the early 19th century's propensity toward disability as public spectacle via the freak show and carnival, as well as the hiding away of disabled children and adults in asylums and almshouses, the 1920s brought about the desire on the part of medical professionals to cure and repair visually anomalous bodies through surgical means. In 1939, 7 years after Henrietta and Billy, Bonnie Van Campbell Van Rosendahl was admitted to the Salt Lake City Shriners Hospital at the age of 2. In an oral history held by the Polio Oral History Project, Bonnie remembers beginning her 11-month stay at the hospital. Quote, I remember holding on to my mom had oblong buttons on her coat, kind of a yellowish greenish coat. I held on to those buttons and cried as they put me in the big iron crib. Anna Maria remembers waking up from surgery and how, quote, you'd throw up for days and you're sick from the ether. I remember the smell. I remember it going on, the ether mask, and then just dropping. Nobody knows what orthopedic surgery is until you've had it. laughs. That's not a fun one. When you went to the hospital, you went into the hospital. You might be planned for 3 or 4 surgeries during a span of time. The history of orthopedic surgical intervention into disabled life in North America dates back to the 19th century, though modes of long-term stay hospitals for disabled kids were in operation as early as the mid-18th century in England as institutions for orphaned or abandoned children. With the founding of the American Orthopedic Association in 1887, orthopedic surgery promised to correct, quote, unnatural positions of the body caused by differing contractions of muscles or skeletal curvatures. A promise to lengthen and reshape, quote, malformed arms and legs so that artificial limbs could be attached to them and the whole body could be, quote, restored to natural form. Surgical treatment aimed to return the deformed body back to its normal natural state. Artificial limbs promised this too. Backed by a desire to restore and cure what were seen as unnatural bodies, orthopedic hospitals grew in popularity throughout the early 20th century and beyond. With its many locations and its charity service, Shriners was an established leader in the field of orthopedic medicine. Prevailing attitudes about contagion and infection shaped hospital architecture in the early 20th century, allowing environments to operate as status symbols of healing. In promotional materials, Shriners hospitals were described as being surrounded by smooth lawns and handsome shrubbery. Indoor environments were depicted as bright, cheerful, and friendly. Shriners developed mobile units where spacious grounds would allow those, quote, handicapped small people to get out on the grass where the sun and wind may aid the doctors in the fight to straighten both spirit and body. They were located on high acreage lots surrounded by open lands unencumbered by trees. Sunlight could easily shine in and patients could easily see out. And what they were able to see was often highly manicured and stylized natural environments along with the daily proceedings of the weather. But while the outside world was seen and witnessed by orthopedic patients, it was not accessible in other ways. Newman, again, describes an environment of enclosure where, quote, to prevent germs from entering the hospital, no visitors were allowed at all. No parents, no clergy, no one. On Sunday, the parents would come onto the lawns outside the wards and talk to the children through the glass. Some brought stepladders to get closer. The residents would go outside and appraise the parents of the child's status. In the 1950s, patients could be wheeled onto hospital lawns during visitation days. Helen Butler, a patient at the Salt Lake City hospital, recalls, "We didn't get to go outside very often. When it was sunny outside, everything was bright, everything, especially in the big ward. But if there was a storm up there on the hill, an electrical storm, the hospital's situated up there, and it has all of these windows, and I was terrified of lightning anyway. But the fact that I felt so exposed made it that much worse. I can remember being terrified whenever there was an electrical storm, huddling with my head under the pillow and crying. I can remember the wind blowing through the blinds. If it wasn't the blinds rattling, it was the wind whistling through the panes of glass. Though patients were not often allowed to go outside, they did bear witness to the changes in the atmosphere and scenery through the hospital's large glass windows. Discourses about natural and unnatural bodies played a vital role in the evolution and prevalence of orthopedic surgery. And once interned in surgical hospitals, natural systems played an important role in daily life. From baby solarias to hospital design that emphasized the healing power of air and light to manicured lawns that hosted hospital beds during monthly visitation, Shriners Hospital also attempted to utilize weather and landscape for healing benefits. In fair weather, it was hoped that children would, quote, regain the use of their limbs through healthful play and exercise, end quote. The weather and the outdoor biological life it supported was suggested to have positive healing effects, while promotional materials, as you can see here, staged children outdoors for the purpose of charitable giving. Patient and doctor testimony suggests that a child's access to the outdoors was highly regulated. Nearest to nature was both about proximity and form. To return to a, quote, deformed body, to return it to its natural state, a child not only had to maintain close proximity to sunlight and open air as a recuperative treatment for disability as illness, They also needed to display near perfect anatomical form, no matter the cost. This required a full surrendering to a surgeon's vision. It did not promise a release from pain, and often invited the pain of surgical recovery, muscle, tissue, skin, and bone reorganization, as well as the long-term discomforts of braces and plaster castings. In trying to achieve these goals, surgical hospitals for physically disabled children created physical spaces where children were isolated from the emotional and psychological supports of their families and caregivers, and held in complex relation to the elements that surrounded them. Stranded at hospitals with, quote, doors locked, as Newman explains, the natural world peeping in, and under the care of the surgeon's knife and the nurse's ether, disabled youth were witnesses to a natural world that lay outside their windows. What other worlds were possible? They wanted to go to the beach, and they wanted to stay there a while. So Earl Casey, a patient and a pupil at the Van Leuven-Brown Hospital School in Michigan, wrote to the mayor of Port Huron in the winter of 1914 to ask if the children of the school could access a camping ground. From May 29th to September 11th of 1915, students from the hospital school lived at Lakeside Park with 2 tents pitched for housing and 1 mess tent, which held a piano, a phonograph with 100 records, a bookcase, desk, and a dining table. The mayor installed floors in the tents, ran electricity in each of them, and laid an underground pipe for water access. At camp, they spent the summer swimming and eating cream pies, playing piano, and picking through 5 pounds of candy from the Port Huron Candy Co. The camp relied on donations, like the 5 pounds of candy, and other things from the nearby community, as well as personal savings from the owner and self-described mother of the hospital school, Blanche Van Leuven-Brown. Earl was the unofficial captain of the camp since he was 17 and the oldest member of the camp that summer. Earl had been a pupil and a patient at the hospital school since the age of 14. He was a wheelchair user and is described as having, quote, atrophy of the muscles in the hospital school's patient intake book. Mildred Quinn, who is described as having paralysis and having been abandoned by both of her birth parents, also attended camp with Earl, alongside 23 other children from the hospital school. All summer, quote, these youngsters had the opportunity of living near the heart of nature and of bathing almost daily in the waters of the Great Lake, described Joseph Sullivan, a disabled teacher at the hospital school. The summer camp was a branch of the Van Leuven-Brown Hospital School, a school and a hospital, as the name implies, founded and run by Blanche Van Leuven-Brown, a disabled woman, herself a survivor of child polio. Brown had spent much of her life in a hospital setting and under a physician's care. She was treated for infantile paralysis from ages 3 to 17. She was a patient of orthopedic surgery throughout that time. In her childhood, adolescence, and early adult life, her education was disrupted by long-term hospitalization and surgical intervention. This drove Brown to envision and operate the hospital school, which began accepting patients in 1907. Much like Shriners, Brown did not accept, quote, feeble-minded pupil patients. And as part of the self-described crippled children's movement at the time, as Leon Duncan has shown, Brown advocated for education for physically disabled children. One undeniable reading of Brown, as Duncan's research attests, is that Brown used education to raise the social status of physically disabled children and later in life disabled adults. In doing this, she gave physically disabled patients a voice in the production of their lives. Brown and the children of the school developed a magazine titled the Van Leuven-Brown Magazine. Similar to other hospital pamphlets of the day, the magazine shared success stories of patients and tried to solicit donations. But it was also different in that it featured children's voices and writings. The children's department showcased writing from the children of the hospital and had a child editor, Zella Berry, who came to the hospital school with the physical after effects of TB. As Duncan has elaborated, the magazine devoted, quote, space to work authored by children in the hospital school, featuring pieces designed to prove their worth and their intellectual capacity. But the hospital school was not simply a school, it was also a hospital. And as such, it promoted unique perspectives on the treatment of physically disabled children that clashed with orthopedic medical practices at the time. Brown's hospital school might seem to fit into the larger genre of, quote, hospitals for crippled children that maintained on-site education facilities, such as Shriners, but it was markedly different from that for two reasons. First, the school did not include orthopedic surgeons on staff. With its focus on nature-based treatment, Brown's school resembled the heritage craft movement of schools, seaside sanatoriums for the treatment of tuberculosis, and farm colonies. But this brings us to the second difference. The school was run for and by disabled people. As such, disabled kids and adults co-created a space of learning and growth where they could exercise will and power. The kids wanted to camp, but so did Brown. While at camp, the kids made their own social norms, and you can see that on the right here. It's a write-up of the laws that they made at camp and how they enforced them. Back at the hospital school, kids gardened by the sleeping porch. I don't have an image of the sleeping porch, but this is a really nice write-up of how they might use the sleeping porch. Non-ambulatory members of the school stayed on the sleeping porch and watched other children in their gardens. Brown also developed outdoor cabins for children in the backyard of the hospital school, allowing them to camp outside prior to their trips to Port Huron. She allowed children also to roam freely, not just in the backyard or on the porch or at the camp, but in the town itself. And again, I'm going to move through these quickly, so if you want to look at them more finely, you can access that version online. She also imagined different forms of mobility for children and brought some of them to pass. This is just an excerpt from her journal. It's difficult to see with the light, but where she's coming up with an idea for a walking chair. And it's somewhat like, although not exactly like, what the child on the right-hand side is using. Brown's hospital school developed a unique view of the physically disabled child as capable and worthy through education, yes, but also through outdoor play and physical exploration of natural environments, such as swimming, running, or simply being able to breathe fresh air. While often related to healing in her writings and throughout the hospital magazine, these activities were also deeply tied to just simply having a meaningful life. The hospital school was a place where disabled youth could develop agency and autonomy within a broader moment in which physically disabled children were institutionalized, separated from their families and loved ones, and underwent surgical interventions that they had no space to contest or consent to. They were forced to inhabit a world after surgery with castings, braces, and prosthetics, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Brown's treatment, or her beliefs about treatment, stood in direct contrast with prevailing modes of medical treatment at the time for physically disabled kids. Those forms of treatment I've elaborated included surgery, casts, braces, and splints. While Brown maintained a set of visiting physicians and encouraged external physicians to allow to treat students in the school, she only kept an osteopathic medicine physician on staff. Brown developed a school where there were, quote, no cutting, no pain, no plaster casts, and where children were, quote, given that which their little bodies craved, fresh air, sunshine, and grounds in which to play. Brown left the hospital school when she could no longer run it, quote, according to the laws of nature. When orthopedic surgery was introduced to the hospital after its absorption into the Michigan Child Welfare League in 1917, Brown stepped down. She wrote, quote, I do not think the knife is the cure. I believe the greatest cure is the air, the water, and the sunshine, good food, and happiness. Nature, who after all is the greatest physician, will do the rest. She advocated for a, quote, natural mode of treatment and a natural way of life. For Brown, orthopedic surgery was antithetical to, quote, this natural way of life that disabled children deserved. A natural way being the ability to move around the world in a way that only a disabled body could. For Brown, orthopedic surgery was an experimental kind of torture that kept disabled kids from living those natural and healthy lives. I don't want to forget Earl in bringing this to a close. So a final note about him. Earl eventually became a teacher at the hospital school, and many of the students at the hospital school did find future work in teaching at the school. And he later developed Camp Akawana, and this camp was an outdoor school for physically disabled children that issued grade school diplomas through the Port Huron Board of Education. In 1923, Earl died at Camp Akawana of causes unknown. The hospital school engaged the natural world in ways that were both accepted and that we wouldn't be surprised to find, and novel for the period. In her rejection of surgical intervention, Brown sought to utilize nature as a treatment for disability, which followed similar efforts made by seaside sanatoriums, surgery-based hospital schools, and farm colonies. However, her and her students embraced nature as more than mere medicine. They attempted to live a natural way of life that included not only a companionship with the elements of the natural world, but an embrace of the physically disabled body as already natural, where corrective surgeries might, quote, straighten a spine, lengthen or shorten limbs, turn feet or hands into an orthopedic version of a normal-looking body. Brown believed that 9 cases out of 10, this is her speaking, cared for by the regular orthopedic methods would be very much better off if they were allowed to live natural, healthy lives. To live naturally included, quote, throwing aside casts and braces, allowing children to climb and tumble with very little restraint, end quote, and pairing crutches with roller skates. Eliminating such restraints or creating tools for enhanced mobility encouraged children to seek outdoor recreation, from swimming to gardening and farming, on their body's own terms, and to create different techniques for being alive in those bodies. A world where disabled bodies are allowed to grow, misalign, and reform alongside and in relation to the natures they inhabit, that was part of Brown's vision. Though she accepted popular discourse about nature cures, that same sunlight and air that surgical hospitals like Shriners used at the time, she also sought to naturalize, quote, deformed bodies and to locate forms of mobility, both physical and social, that relied not on corrective and correction and assimilation into ableist norms, but rather promoted the movement of disabled life through uniquely disabled form. Nature was not mere health or witness to a child's life. It was a rowdy companion and at times teacher. What does this foray into a small slice of disability history have to offer us today? Here we have traced a lineage of ableist thought from the early 20th century that sought to align physically disabled bodies with notions of the unnatural. Not surprising. In this period, proximity to nature, as well as realignment through surgery, promised to return the body to natural form. But second, a less dominant subculture located in the early, quote, crippled child's movement, as exemplified by Brown and her school, opened up a different way to think about the status of physical disability as children sought the earth out as a companion traveler in varied form and feeling. The Brown School asks us to trouble cure culture, dissolving the natural and unnatural binary. How might we turn the kaleidoscope of trouble a bit more here to ask questions of the way that we approach curing disabled environments? What ways of living might be possible if the surgeon withheld their knife? Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Here, for those of you online, questions will be posted here where I can get to them. In the meantime, and give Sarah a little bit of time to rest and invite questions from the audience. We have mics running, asking early career scholars, students, see if they have a first question or not. by my count, there we go.
All right, hi, thank you. I really appreciated your summary at the end, like what is this story that you shared have to offer us? And I was wondering, because you mentioned, so Brown offered this alternative vision of how we could care for disabled children. And you mentioned the crippled children's movement. I wonder if you could elaborate on, like, was Brown really isolated, or were there other examples across the country, and like who is she speaking to?
This is on. Okay. Should I respond to that? Or okay. Yeah. Thanks for that question. A great person to look at with respect to that is Leanne Duncan, who's done a lot of work on that movement and sort of how Brown was connected to others. I think in the moment that she was leading the school, she was not very isolated, but and she was connected to like Joseph Sullivan and other disabled folks who were interested in education as a way to sort of liberate disabled kids and adults. But that moment where she wrote her piece on the vivisection of children, that was a moment in which she really lost her connections. She left the school. In coming out against orthopedic surgery so vocally, she lost her community ties as well. But Duncan's work is really, really helpful in tracing how both children at the Brown School and disabled teachers there sort of picked up the momentum of what Brown was working for and carried it forth. And actually, Joseph Sullivan became the editor of the Michigan Hospital School Journal, retitled after Brown left. And he had actually different opinions about orthopedic surgery. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great talk. I had a very similar question, and it was asking how Brown's movement has sort of transpired, or whatever versions that have come after that since then. So like if there's any, like what the contemporary debates are around this. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. One thing that really interests me, especially with this work that I'm doing, is that children who were in orthopedic hospitals in 1920s, 1930s, then became the adults who were organizing in the 1960s. So the Michigan Hospital School was a very small school, and I don't know that I expect to see the kids who were there doing the work of advocacy in the 60s and the 70s, and that's still like work that's ongoing. But I think for me, it's a really interesting trajectory of, you know, a child who is in this moment sort of struggling within this medical atmosphere does eventually become an adult. And so trying to trace that throughout time and sort of what happened in that period is really interesting to me.
You just answered my question, so I'll just pass it on.
Thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit more about how people in these different movements understood the agency of nature. I'm curious, the distinction between sort of nature as a site of healing and joy and growth versus the sort of nature as a corrective, and thinking about kind of other uses of nature and manual labor during this period, and nature as a way to assimilate new Americans. I'm curious kind of how people in these two very different approaches to disabled children's bodies understood what kind of action nature could take.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from the patient perspective, it's difficult to reconstruct because this, why it is I chose a research topic where it's so difficult to actually get to primary sources, I cannot answer for you today. But, you know, patient records are typically protected under US law. Some of the early 20th century records aren't protected, and so you can find those in archives. And they are typically records from the perspective of a medical provider. The polio oral history project was a really interesting find that actually spoke to the experiences that children in these long-term stay hospitals had of their environments, both the built environment, but also, you know, many, many times where the interviewee is recalling that, like, we couldn't go outside, but we could always see what was happening outside. And I really felt a deep connection to the kid who was like witnessing a storm, but had like no parent or loved one to run to. And so I think that's one way that you can reconstruct that. I think from the perspective of physicians and hospitals, nature had a curative value to it. And it also was imagined to be, it was fun to be outside from their perspective for the children. But again, like that was all, they were, you know, scripted experiences, I guess you could say, of being able to go outside at, you know, the first hospital that I looked at. But I think the second case with the Brown School opens that up a little bit, so that we're not just saying like, oh, well, nature is good, like it's good for them to be outside and be there, but this question about what are the ways in which youth are consenting to their natural cures or to this kind of being in nature, which is really what brought me to this question of companionship and whether that was actually even possible. And I found in the first case it wasn't, and the second case provides a little bit more sort of like material for that interpretation. And also there's a great book by Nancy Gerlach Spriggs called Restorative Gardens that I think gets a little bit more to the joy part that you were speaking of.
So, Sara, I had a question thinking about, so your two stories take place in the early 20th century, and there's been a lot of environmental changes since then. Yeah. Thinking of the specific places now, how do you imagine the stories would be different, if at all, from the changes that that happened there locally? And if you imagined, or maybe you don't have to imagine, in a world like right now, how did the broader scale environmental changes, you know, sort of chemical pollution, climatic change, environmental degradation of different types, to what extent do they change the landscape on which this is happening?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question that is being hotly debated in disability studies right now. I think Sonora Taylor's book, Disabled Ecologies, which really suggests that we are beginning to live through this age of disability in which there's a correspondence between disabled peoples and also disabled landscapes. Essentially that our environment can be an injured patient just as disabled people are. That's a very particular interpretation of disability. But I think people are also trying to grapple with the environmental justice, the history of environmental justice, how to link that up to disability history and disability studies. Because often in environmental justice, we see that toxic exposure is an injustice, it's a harm. And disability studies would contend that disability is also a state of vitality. That's Julia Watts-Belsar who says that. And so how do you sort of bring together those two things, right? This disability being a state of vitality. What would it mean to say that a Superfund exists in a state of vitality? And actually, Robin Wall Kimmerer has that great piece, The Sacred and the Superfund, which doesn't get quite at that, but sort of tries to wrap our minds around that question. Can you have reverence for a Superfund? Can you love a Superfund site? And so I think that it's not a question that's been really answered, but it's sort of in the conversation right now. I'd also say that Shriners Hospital is alive and well. It is a hospital that exists, and they use nature-based therapy, horse therapy, with their patients. I suppose what I would introduce to that although I'm not working on what they do in the present day, is sort of, again, this question around, or the quality around consenting to environmental healing. I think that for me is the crux, especially with pediatric patients.
There are other questions in the audience. So, I mean, maybe, oh, is that a hand or is that, no? It is? Yes. Okay, well, wait, the mic will get there, and I would.
What a wonderful question, thank you. I want to just start at the end there, because I think in my reading of Brown, what I see is not that the body can't change, but that its alterations or capacity for change is not brought on through the medical establishment. So it's brought on through a kind of from the ground up mobility that's desired and sought out by the patient. I mean, I think that that's that's a very optimistic reading of Brown and the school. But that I'm really interested in the possibility of that, and about the plasticity and medical experimentation that's sort of like, look at what we can do. I think there are a lot of overtones in terms of Jules' work and this, and I'm thinking also of the book Underflows and sort of the way that environments are configured as mobile, and the word, plasticity isn't used there, but in similar ways, we're thinking about movement and where that movement comes from, or where new formations are coming from. And for me, it's what I'm curious about in this period is when it's coming from disabled people themselves. So finding that is hard, especially when you're looking through medical archives, but it gets easier as you move on in the century. I think the early 20th century period is a really tough place to look for that, and yet it is also this period in which there is a lot of experimentation on physically disabled bodies for the reasons that you're raising. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's a totally different moment and trajectory, and I think that there's a difference between a person who has lost something trying to gain or to restore their body to a form that they understood to be natural or normal, as opposed to a child who is coming to know their body as such and then sort of trying to then know a normative form that was never belonged to them. But I think that's a great direction that I'd like to continue to think about and look into. Thanks.
There's a question over there.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I was thinking about the concept of life in relation to your lecture, because part of the reason why people are aiming to quote unquote correct the disabled body might be coming from the concept of life, like wholly in one body, like life enclosed in one organism, and the body is a whole like entity that sustains life. Whereas when we change our perspective, for example, how Donna Haraway explores when life exists between the connections, when one body are like interdependent with other bodies and nature. Mm-hmm. In that case, like that explains your cases in different ways, like, but in the same spirit of what you were explaining. For example, the second case, the school was allowing the students to freely roam and make their own connections to the life, therefore maintaining their vitality, whereas in the first case, they were enclosed and not allowed to make other connections. I was wondering, like, you have any further thoughts or insights on like this different perspective?
That's a fantastic way to put that, and I really appreciate you bringing that to us and letting us think a little bit more about these different ways of conceiving of being alive. And the more networked approach resonates with me and with this work, and I think that's what I'm constantly trying to seek out in the primary source material. I do think there's a way, even in the orthopedic hospitals, that the life is networked and the body is networked too, but those networks can be experienced by patients as negative. If they're painful, also existing without sort of like emotional and psychological support of elders. So I think I'm really appreciative of how you framed that, and we should think more about that with respect to the corollaries between sort of disabled life and the environments that we inhabit, that surround us, that help to form us. Yeah.
So, Sarah, I have a question that came in, and I'm going to try and sort of express. So the talk reminded the person sending the question of children's books of fiction, like Heidi of the Alps in the 1880s and The Secret Garden in the 1910, where the main character loves the outdoors, and then befriends somebody that's either sick or in bed, and then brings that person into nature, either in the Alps or the Secret Garden. And I only know Heidi from the cartoons as a kid, so I never read it. But curious to see whether such popular works of fiction were informed by real life things going on at the time. Are they roughly coincident in time, although in the 1880s and 1910 are before? Do you think, is there any connection, or are they existing in parallel universes? Or?
I don't think quite parallel universes. I'd have to think more about that, but I love the way this person is thinking about the relationships and the connections between these things. And certainly, I mean, I'm not sure if I think I did show this picture with the Brown School, and then I think we also saw it with the visitation day at Shriners, of wheeling the beds out onto the lawns or, into, I think that was actually a bed at the camp that had just been wheeled by the shore. That is happening. And so I'd say, yes, there's a connection there. And I'm also, I would imagine that popular fiction, depending on what it is sort of slightly reworking what is happening. And someone in the world in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, like they would just be reading the pamphlets of these hospitals or these hospital schools. And what you see in the pamphlets, it's actually like a beautiful vision, which is the kids are outside a lot, they're playing football. I don't think I showed some of those images, but they're sort of recreating in ways that able-bodied kids would be also. But that, from my vantage point, is a fiction. And it's designed to raise money. And part of the work in this project has been to try to make sense of the promotional materials that are used to raise money for the hospitals, and then locating as best as I can patient records or patient stories that are coming from patients themselves. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I was just informed it's time to wrap up. And so with this, I'd like you to join me again, thanking Sara.
Thank you for being here.
And you're around?
I'm around, yeah.
Right. So thank you very much. And keep your eye out. In fall, we will have more of these again.